But peace was an illusion. The bombs I'd helped drop in Korea were coming home. It started with the cattle. My neighbor, Bill Crawford, called me one morning in April 1954. His voice was shaky, confused. "Audie," he said, "something's wrong with my herd. Real wrong. You better come see this." Bill had been ranching for 30 years. He'd survived droughts, floods, market crashes. His grandfather had homesteaded this land in 1889, and the Crawford family had weathered every crisis Texas could throw at them. But when I drove over to his spread that gray morning, I saw something in his weathered eyes I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. 23 of his cattle were dead. Not sick, not injured, simply dead, lying scattered across the pasture like they'd just stopped living. The smell was wrong, too. Not the familiar odor of natural death, but something chemical, something that made my war-trained instincts scream danger. Dr. Patterson, the veterinarian from town, was standing over one of the carcasses, his Geiger counter clicking rapidly. The sound reminded me of machine gun fire, steady and ominous. I'd heard that sound too many times in Europe and Korea. "Radiation," Dr. Patterson said quietly. "High levels. Higher than anything I've ever seen outside a laboratory or weapons test site." I felt ice form in my veins. How is that possible? "That's what we're trying to figure out," he replied, but his eyes met mine with knowledge that made my stomach clench. "Audie, you were in Korea, weren't you?" But I already knew. Deep down, in the part of my soul that carried the weight of November 28, 1950, I knew exactly how this was possible. The wind doesn't respect borders. The atmosphere doesn't care about military objectives. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern spread across East Texas. Farm after farm reporting the same mysterious deaths. Then Louisiana, then Arkansas, then Oklahoma. Cattle dying without explanation. Crops failing despite good weather. Milk samples showing contamination levels that made government scientists speak in hushed whispers. The calls started coming in from agricultural extension offices across the region. Reports filtered up through state health departments to the CDC in Atlanta. Something was systematically poisoning the American heartland, and no one in official channels wanted to acknowledge what it might be. Dr. James Morrison from the University of Texas called me personally. We'd met briefly during the war. He'd been a young physicist working on classified projects. Now he was older, graying, and his voice carried terrible knowledge. "Audie," he said when we met at a diner in Austin, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I nodded, studying his haunted face. In the harsh fluorescent light, he looked like a man carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear. The nuclear weapons used in Korea. How many were there? What were their yields? And where exactly were they detonated? The question hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I was back in that B-29 over Shenyang, watching the flash that turned night into day, feeling the aircraft buck from the shockwave. "Why?" I managed to ask. He pulled out a thick folder spreading photographs across the table. Aerial shots of contaminated farmland. Close-ups of soil samples. Medical reports showing unusual cancer clusters. Because the isotope signatures we're finding match exactly with Mark IV nuclear devices. The atmospheric circulation patterns show contamination that originated in Northeast Asia approximately 4 years ago. The fallout has been circling the globe, and now it's settling. It's not just Texas, Audie. We're finding this contamination across the entire American Midwest. I stared at the photographs, seeing farmland that looked disturbingly similar to my own ranch. In my mind, I could see Shenyang burning, could hear the pilots reporting successful strikes, could remember MacArthur's satisfaction as he marked targets off his operational map. 6 bombs, I said quietly. 6 Mark, 4 devices. November 28, 1950. Primary target was Shenyang. Secondary targets were supply depots in Manchuria. Dr. Morrison nodded grimly. Each weapon was approximately 21 kilotons. That's what they told us. We were told the fallout would be minimal because they were air bursts, not ground bursts. We were told the radiation would dissipate quickly. They were wrong, Doctor, Morrison said simply. The radioactive particles entered the upper atmosphere during the explosions. They've been circling the globe for 4 years, slowly settling as microscopic dust. Your Korean victory, Audie. It's been poisoning America all this time. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood on my porch until dawn, thinking about atmospheric currents and radioactive particles and the children getting sick in Nebraska because I'd made a choice in Korea 4 years ago. The irony was bitter. We'd used nuclear weapons to save American lives, and now those same weapons were taking American lives in slow motion. Terry, my 3-year-old daughter, came out in her pajamas. "Daddy, why are you sad?" How do you explain to a child that her father helped poison the air she breathes? But even as this horror unfolded, Washington was preparing to make the same mistakes again. The call came from General Taylor on May 8, 1954, Terry's birthday. I had to leave her party to take the call. "Murphy, we need your expertise. Situation in Vietnam is deteriorating rapidly. French are surrounded at Dien Bien Phu. President Eisenhower wants your assessment on military intervention." "What kind of intervention?" "Conventional forces initially. Air support for the French. Maybe ground advisors. Nothing nuclear unless absolutely necessary." I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. "General, are you aware of what's happening here in America? The contamination from Korea?" "That's a separate issue, Murphy. We're talking about stopping communist expansion in Southeast Asia. The domino theory, if Vietnam falls, all of Southeast Asia could follow." "It's not a separate issue," I said, watching Terry play with her birthday presents through the window. "It's the same issue. We act without thinking about long-term consequences, and 4 years later American farmers are dying. The president has made his decision. We're considering sending military advisors to Vietnam. We want you to head the assessment team." I hung up and returned to my daughter's party, but the cake tasted like ash. The next morning I drove to Bill Crawford's ranch. The situation had worsened overnight. More cattle were dead, 37 now. His children, 2 boys aged 8 and 10, were showing symptoms of radiation sickness, fatigue, nausea, skin problems. His wife Sarah was 5 months pregnant, and Dr. Patterson had quietly suggested they consider termination because of potential birth defects. Bill met me at his truck, his face gray with exhaustion. "Audie, what the hell is happening to us? My family's been on this land for 3 generations. We've survived everything: drought, depression, war. But this is different." I couldn't tell him the truth, that his cattle were dying because of a decision I'd made on the other side of the world 4 years ago. That his children were sick because radioactive particles from Shenyang had finally drifted home on the wind. This was what victory looked like. This was what saving American lives actually cost. That evening, I called President Eisenhower directly. "Mr. President, I need 10 minutes of your time." "Murphy, what's this about?" "It's about the radioactive contamination spreading across America from our nuclear strikes in Korea. And it's about the fact that you're about to send American troops into Vietnam without learning anything from what happened." There was a long pause. "I'll see you tomorrow at 2. The flight to Washington gave me time to prepare. I brought Dr. Morrison's photographs, the contamination reports, the medical data from the affected farms. Most importantly, I brought my own conscience, which had been growing heavier with each passing day. The Oval Office felt smaller than I remembered. Eisenhower looked older, more tired. The weight of the presidency showed in the lines around his eyes. "Speak your piece, Murphy." I spread Dr. Morrison's photographs across his desk. Contaminated farmland, medical reports, atmospheric circulation models showing how the poison had traveled. "Mr. President, every nuclear weapon we used in Korea has consequences that are still unfolding. American soil is contaminated. American children are getting sick. American farmers are losing their livelihoods. Because we thought we could contain the effects of nuclear war." Eisenhower studied the images carefully. "This is unfortunate, but we can't let isolated incidents derail our national security strategy." "It's not unfortunate, sir, it's predictable. And now you're about to send troops to Vietnam based on the same thinking. The domino theory, the idea that we can control outcomes through military force, the belief that our actions won't have unforeseeable consequences. Vietnam is different. We're not talking about nuclear weapons, no sir, but we're talking about the same overconfidence, the same willingness to act first and deal with consequences later. In Korea, we thought nuclear weapons would end the war quickly and cleanly. Instead, we're poisoning our own country 4 years later." I leaned forward. "Mr. President, I've seen what happens when we intervene in Asian civil wars. Before you send American boys to Vietnam, you need to understand what the real price might be." Eisenhower was quiet for a long time. "What are you suggesting, Murphy?" "I'm suggesting we learn from Korea. Maybe not every international problem requires an American military solution. The French are losing because they're fighting a colonial war against people who want independence. Sending American advisors won't change that fundamental reality. And if all of Southeast Asia falls to communism, then we'll deal with that through diplomacy, through economic aid, through every tool except the one that's currently poisoning Texas farmland." The meeting lasted 2 hours. I told him about Bill Crawford's family, about the impossible choice they faced regarding Sarah's pregnancy. I told him about the cancer clusters appearing in farming communities across the Midwest. I told him about children playing in contaminated soil because their fathers had once thought nuclear weapons could solve complex problems. But 3 days after our meeting, the situation in Vietnam deteriorated faster than anyone anticipated. General Taylor called again, his voice urgent, almost panicked. "Murphy, the Chinese have crossed into Vietnam. 50,000 regular PLA troops supporting the Viet Minh. The Soviets are airlifting supplies directly to Dien Bien Phu. This isn't just a French colonial war anymore. It's become a direct East-West confrontation." I felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on my shoulders. What's the Pentagon recommending? Nuclear strikes on Chinese supply lines. President wants to authorize Mark 6 weapons, bigger than what we used in Korea. 24 weapons targeted at Chinese positions. They're saying it's the only way to stop full communist takeover of Southeast Asia. The irony was sickening. Here I was, watching American farmland poisoned by radioactive fallout from Korea, while the Pentagon wanted to repeat the same mistake on an even larger scale. And if I refuse to support nuclear action? Then you're the only alternative, Murphy. The President trusts you. Congress will approve funding if you lead the operation. But it has to be conventional forces only. No nuclear weapons under any circumstances. It was the devil's bargain. Accept command of what would become America's first major military intervention in Vietnam, or watch as nuclear weapons became the standard solution to every international crisis. I thought about Bill Crawford's dying cattle, about the pregnant women being advised to terminate their pregnancies, about Dr. Morrison's contamination maps showing poison spreading across the American heartland. "I'll do it," I said, "but I want it in writing from the President. No nuclear weapons in Southeast Asia under any circumstances." "Audie, no circumstances, General. If I'm going to lead American boys into Vietnam, it's going to be the kind of war we can actually win without poisoning half the world." On May 12, 1954, I was appointed as the first American commander of the Military Assistance Advisory Group, Vietnam. My orders were simple: prevent communist takeover of South Vietnam using conventional forces only. Dien Bien Phu fell on May 7th. But by then, the game had changed completely. This wasn't about saving the French Empire anymore. It was about preventing World War III from going nuclear. I arrived in Saigon on May 20th, 1954, with the first contingent of 10,000 American military advisors. The radioactive rain was still falling in Texas, but now I had a new war to fight and a new set of impossible choices to make. The Vietnamese conflict I helped escalate that spring would eventually consume over 58,000 American lives and stretch across 3 presidential administrations. But at least it remained conventional. At least no more radioactive clouds drifted across the Pacific to poison American farmland. I commanded American forces in Vietnam from 1954 to 1961. 7 years that aged me more than all my previous combat experience combined. We won battles but couldn't win the war. We saved South Vietnam from immediate conquest but couldn't create a stable society. We prevented nuclear escalation but created conventional escalation that consumed a generation. The weight of command in an undeclared war was crushing. Every decision carried consequences measured in American casualties and Vietnamese civilian deaths. Every tactical success seemed to require a strategic compromise. Every month brought requests for more troops, more air support, more commitment to a cause that grew murkier with each passing year. I kept Bill Crawford's wife's baby picture, little Mary Crawford, born healthy despite everything, in my wallet throughout the Vietnam years. It reminded me of what we were really fighting for. But as the years passed and the casualties mounted, I began to wonder if we were creating the very future we'd sought to prevent. As for me, I never took off my uniform again. The Korean War medals stayed in their case, but now they were joined by new decorations and new regrets. I became the architect of America's longest war, the man who chose boots on the ground over nuclear fire in the sky. People call me the father of American involvement in Vietnam. They say I prevented nuclear escalation while creating conventional escalation. Maybe that's true. But I also learned that in the nuclear age, sometimes you don't get good choices. You only get choices you can live with. The radioactive rain from Korea taught me that some victories are too expensive, even when you win. The Vietnam War taught me that sometimes preventing one catastrophe means accepting responsibility for another. Both lessons came with a price that's still being paid today, by people who never got to vote on whether any of it was worth the cost. When I finally retired from active duty in 1961, I returned to Texas to find that the radiation levels had mostly returned to normal. Bill Crawford's sons had grown up healthy despite their early exposure, and little Mary Crawford was starting school. The immediate crisis had passed, but the long-term effects would persist for decades. Let me ask you this. When your only choices are nuclear war or conventional war, how do you decide which catastrophe is more acceptable? And when you prevent the poisoning of the atmosphere by accepting the poisoning of a generation, how do you measure the weight of different kinds of moral failure?